This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air with breaking developments in the unprecedented federal indictment of former President Donald Trump. The Justice Department has just unsealed the indictment against Trump, revealing the charges before the American people now. It was shortly after 7 p.m. Eastern last night. We went on the air after sources told ABC News a grand jury in Miami had indicted the former president on at least 7 charges. We'll pause here because we now believe that that number is going to be far higher as we now pour through this indictment. Among the charges, and this is the range, it includes illegal retention of government documents regarding national security, conspiracy, obstruction of government efforts to retrieve those documents. ABC News also confirming the former president said in an audio recording in 2021 that he had taken classified information with him to Mar-a-Lago after leaving the White House, acknowledging, quote, "As president, I could have declassified, but now I can't." Again, this indictment just unsealed. It is 49 pages long. I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, you and I were talking extensively last night on the air and off about whether or not this would be a speaking indictment, what they call a speaking indictment in the legal world, whether it would lay out in granular detail what this evidence is, why they think they have what they need to move forward with what appears to be a statement that includes charges far more than the 7 we had initially had heard about from sources. Pierre, this is a speaking indictment?
David, it's a speaking indictment. It is an incredible narrative. They're laying out chapter and verse what took place. And one of the things that strikes me as I read through it right off the top, they're basically saying that Donald Trump was collecting classified documents in the same way that he was collecting newspaper articles. And that, quote, as of January 20th, 2021, as he departed the White House, Trump caused scores of boxes, many which contain classified documents, to be transported to the Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach. And then it goes on to state that how this club was full of thousands of guests and visitors, and it was not the type of place that you should keep these kinds of documents. So it begins a long narrative. It's complete with pictures. There are examples of how the documents were removed as well, and also the story that we were talking about in terms of the audio recording in which Trump describes, having taken classified documents from the White House, and clearly knowing that he should not talk about any of this information, and just a stunning example of facts laid out brick by brick by the Justice Department.
Pierre Thomas with us. Pierre is just reading the indictment. And again, we're going through the counts as we're on the air here, and I'm just going to read from what we have so far. 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, 1 count of withholding a document or a record, 1 count of corruptly concealing a document or record, 1 count of concealing a document in a federal investigation, 1 count of scheme to conceal, 1 count of false statements and representations, 2 counts of false statements and representations. That's the list of counts. This is well more than 30 counts. And as we were on the air last night, sources telling us that the Trump team was aware of at least 7 counts, at least a range of 7 areas of charges. Now that this indictment has been unsealed, we see this as far more extensive in its nature. I want to bring in John Santucci, who's looking at this indictment too. And you see, John, the narrative form of this indictment, the great detail, even the photographs they have included to help tell their story.
Yeah, David, as you well know, I have been to Mar-a-Lago many times over the years, and there was an image for our control room that we just showed when you were talking with Pierre. That is a ballroom right off of Mar-a-Lago. It's the image, David, we see of boxes on a stage for the control room to show our viewers. That is a room, David, that is surrounded by French doors. It is easily accessible. Anybody can walk in there. I have walked freely in and out of that ballroom. It's quite small. It's right along one of the main entrances to Mar-a-Lago. And you see in that image, David, the amount of boxes that are just stacked there, and the notes that we're reading in this indictment against the former president, now that it's been unsealed, say that they were stored there for quite some time. crime. These were documents that were just left out and about, far more significant than we had first learned. Because remember, when we had been going through our reporting with the teams for the last several months, as we've been hearing about this, we had heard about documents kept in the former president's office, in his residence, in a storage closet below the pool. But to just see, strikingly, the images of them just left out freely in a room that anyone could access. Because remember, Mar-a-Lago, as we both know, David, this is not a private residence. This is a club. People can come in. There are guests. You could be a guest of a guest and come have lunch out on the pool deck. It's really quite amazing to see that there is documents just left out freely in open places where, frankly, anyone could go.
All right, John, let us know as soon as you hear from anyone in Trump's orbit, their reaction, because it's my understanding that the moment this was unsealed is the moment they're now seeing the extent of these counts. Again, 38 total counts from Special Counsel Jack Smith. I want to bring in our senior investigative reporter, Aaron Katersky. He is live in Florida for us at this hour. And of course, it is in Florida at federal court in Miami, where the former president has been told to show up in federal court Tuesday afternoon at 3. And again, Aaron, this number, 38 total counts, obviously historic to charge a former president with federal criminal charges. But the number itself is quite staggering.
The number is staggering, and these charges, some of them fall under the Espionage Act, David. They fall under obstruction statutes that, taken together, are in theory punishable by decades in prison. And for the first time, we are getting an official list from the special counsel via this indictment of what it is that former President Trump is alleged to have retained. The documents, of course, are not specific. They're not suddenly going to reveal classified information, but we get descriptions. For example, one document dated October 18th, 2019, concerns military capabilities of a foreign country. And the list goes on like that, so the American people can have a full accounting of what it is that the former president is alleged to have taken from the White House to his estate in West Palm Beach, and what he is illegally, in the eyes of the special counsel, tried to obstruct the government from retrieving. And specifically, David, some of the charges put quotes in Trump's mouth, instructing an aide who was also charged in this case to specifically move the boxes, or at least have other aides say, this is what Trump wants to happen. So the special counsel seems to be convinced that there is enough intent here that Trump did this willfully, allegedly, David.
And that also is a significant point, because there were a lot of questions about whether this would target the former president only, or whether it would be a conspiracy. And as you point out, Jack Smith goes into detail about what he believes he has discovered as far as others being aware of what the former president's wishes were when it came to these documents.
In fact, an aide to the former president, Walter Nauta, is also charged in this indictment and charged being in a conspiracy with the former president to obstruct the effort by the federal government to retrieve the more than 300 documents with classified markings that were ultimately found at the former president's estate in West Palm Beach. The 38 total counts, most of them involve the willful retention of national defense information, but the others talk about not the crime, David, but the cover-up, the effort to thwart the government in its effort to retrieve.
You've been listening to Aaron Katersky report from outside federal court in Miami, where the former president will appear come Tuesday, 3 p.m. in the afternoon. It's our belief, our team reporting, that the former president and his legal team just now seeing this indictment after it's been unsealed for the first time in this level of detail, if you will. The 38 total counts revealed in this indictment from Jack Smith, the special counsel. And again, you heard Aaron talk about the range of some of these documents. That just one example, a document that went into the military capabilities of a foreign country. I know that Pierre Thomas, our chief justice correspondent, has also been pouring through this indictment. And Pierre, you have immediately tried to find perhaps some of the most damning areas of what Jack Smith believes he and his team have uncovered.
David, it's remarkable. They say on 2 occasions in 2021, Trump showed the classified documents to other people. So they're alleging that he actually took these classified, these sensitive documents and showed them to other people. They also are being very specific about what the obstruction was. Quote, he suggested to his attorney that they falsely represent to the FBI and the grand jury that Trump did not have documents called for by the grand jury subpoena. He also said, allegedly, that he directed his attorney to hide or destroy documents called for by the grand jury subpoena. So the special counsel is putting Trump as directly telling people to lie, to hide and move documents. And as Aaron just pointed out, Walter Nuna, who was one of his top aides, he was directed to, quote, move boxes of documents and conceal them from Trump's attorney. So they're making the case, as we previously reported, that Trump was, in some cases, tricking his attorneys to make representations that were, in fact, not true.
And in some cases, it would seem from what you just read, Pierre, not even trying to trick them, but telling them, as you say, suggesting that they hide or destroy documents?
That, again, that is a direct quote. Suggested to his attorney that he, quote, hide or destroy documents called for by the grand jury subpoena. And, David, here's why that's significant. The grand jury subpoena is not just the Justice Department. It's a federal judge saying, give back these documents. So this is making the case that President Trump, number one, took classified documents of the highest and most sensitive nature. When it was made clear to him that he should return the documents, that he went about a process of trying to keep some of these documents to himself. And again, I think one of the things that's most surprising, and we've not heard this until today, that he actually showed the documents to other people on 2 different occasions, classified documents, David.
It also would seem to reveal, Pierre, just the sheer extent, the number of people the special counsel in this investigation, this grand jury has heard from, very close to Donald Trump, who would have direct knowledge, obviously. When you hear about suggesting, in Jack Smith's words, in the indictment, as it reads, that attorneys were told to hide or destroy documents, that Donald Trump had been informed that they were aware were missing and needed to be returned, that's where the obstruction comes in. It would seem to reveal the sheer scope of the number of people they were able to get to talk here.
Absolutely, David. And also what it strongly suggests is that some of these people have become witnesses for the government. How do they know this information? How can he put this in a document unless he believes that he can document this information and that he can verify this information to a court and to a jury potentially? So again, we're still reading through this, but a key question that you've now locked in on, David, is who has been talking to the special counsel? Who are the witnesses? And what more will we learn about what they've been telling the special counsel and the FBI?
And if these witnesses, having recognized what they saw and observed themselves, now are trying to protect themselves legally as the whole investigation moves forward and now culminates with this 38-count indictment from Jack Smith and the special counsel. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, also poring over this indictment. And Dan, when you hear Pierre Thomas laser in on the obstruction here and what Jack Smith is alleging that Donald Trump suggested to his attorneys and to those around him, and again, it's spelled out in the indictment, that they allegedly hide or destroy documents instead of returning them, that underscores how serious, how heavy these charges are.
And it goes to the intentionality of the conduct. This is something we've talked about before. That's the critical point here as a legal matter, is being able to show he knew what he was doing and he did it on purpose. And that is very much what those sections of the indictment lay out. But I would say that sort of for the American people, there may be even more significant portions here, because there are a lot of people who are saying, well, okay, he had this power to declassify anyway, whether he did or didn't after, when it happened. But here's what's really important as I read through this, is 31 of the counts relate to the willful retention of national defense information. For that charge, whether it was classified or not classified, doesn't really matter as a legal matter. What matters is the documents were important. They were sensitive. They were critical. And when you read through the summaries, and you heard Aaron do a couple of them, number 19 of the 31 is undated document concerning nuclear weaponry of the United States. That's one of the documents that we're talking about. So when you're talking about a case where you've got the intersection of law and politics and convincing the American public, I think part of what this document is doing is saying, not only was there this intentional conduct, not only was he trying to cover this up, but the documents were really serious, and a lot of them were held. I mean, they even quote at one point saying that they were stored at Mar-a-Lago at one point in the white and gold ballroom, making the point that this is not the way anyone should be storing these kinds of sensitive documents, no matter how they got there, no matter what the classification was, et cetera. And then when you read the various accounts of which documents they were, which are just brief summaries, the point is serious stuff.
Dan, just to underscore what you've mentioned there, and Pierre actually cited a couple of examples too, and I just want to reiterate this for the audience watching our live coverage here on ABC News of what we're learning in this 38-count indictment. 37 of the counts are directly targeting the former president. This is for a myriad charges, including willful retention. And that was the point Dan Abrams was making, that it wasn't just that he had these in his possession, it was willful retention is what the allegation is from Jack Smith. 31 counts involve national defense documents. As you heard Pierre Thomas report, one document in particular talked about the military capabilities of a foreign country. Dan Abrams adding to the conversation, saying another document allegedly involved nuclear weaponry, the nuclear capabilities of the U.S. And again, this wasn't, Jack Smith is not saying here, not alleging here that this was accidentally in his possession, but that he was willfully retaining these documents. And to add a layer onto that is this layer of obstruction, that once government authorities learned that he had these documents in his possession, that then there was this added layer of obstruction, efforts to not return the documents. The allegation in this indictment that's now been unsealed, among the allegations when it comes to obstruction, is that he informed attorneys, people in his circle, again, this is according to the special counsel, to hide or destroy documents. And I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, because that would seem to be a significant piece of this indictment, John.
Absolutely, David. And to underscore the sensitivity of these documents, you heard Dan Abrams mention an undated document related to the nuclear programs of the United States. It seems to me, reading what Jack Smith has written here in this indictment, that this is multiple documents. Just listen to this description. The classified documents Trump stored in his boxes included information regarding defense and weapon capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries, plural. Not a single foreign country, foreign countries. United States nuclear programs, again, plural. Potential vulnerabilities of the United States and its allies to military attack. It's hard to imagine more sensitive documents other than if it were a list of secret agents even. This is talking about the vulnerabilities of the United States to a military attack. Can you imagine a more sensitive piece of information? And then the description of the obstruction, which is clearly central to this case, is not just that he took these documents with him, but that he tried mightily to prevent the federal government from getting the documents back, to defy a subpoena, multiple subpoenas. Saying, as you mentioned, suggesting his attorneys hide or destroy documents, suggesting that his attorneys lie in a sworn statement to say that all the documents had been turned over. And of course, what we've mentioned regarding Walt Nauta, who was his valet in the White House. A young aide, a Navy veteran, ordering him to move these documents. I think what's happening here, David, is clearly the special counsel felt it was important to get the details, to get the facts out. Because what we have seen so far since news of the indictment broke late yesterday is the president, the former president, and his allies, frankly, some of his top allies in Congress, attacking the very notion of this indictment, accusing this of being a political indictment, coming wholeheartedly to the defense of Donald Trump without knowing any of the facts. And now you see, 40 plus pages of meticulous detail, exactly what Donald Trump is accused of and what the evidence, at least some of the evidence against him is. It'll be interesting now to see what some of those Republican leaders who have come forward and attacked the Justice Department for a political prosecution will say now when confronted with actual facts and evidence compiled as a result of the special counsel investigation.
Just sticking with that for a moment, John, because you listed even more as we all pour through this indictment. Pierre and Dan and now John Carl have laid out the extent of some of these documents that Jack Smith said the former president had in his possession, the defense capabilities of not only the U.S. but several foreign countries, U.S. nuclear programs in great detail, potential vulnerabilities of the U.S. To come under military attack from a foreign country. And I think, John, it's also really important to point out here, and you and I, as longtime reporters out covering politics and these runs for the president and then these presidencies, particularly when it came to Donald Trump. Now, certainly never showed either one of us a classified document, but he was always willing to say, look, I want to show you something, whether it was a newspaper article or what have you. And there's an allegation in this indictment about how he showed, allegedly, some of this classified information to other people.
At the very least, to the people that were working with his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, on writing Mark Meadows' book. This is, one key piece of evidence is the audio tape of that discussion where Trump is referring to a highly, what he is describing as a highly sensitive, highly classified document regarding a potential plan for attack that was prepared for him against Iran. Again, think about how sensitive that is. Iran has a rapidly advancing nuclear program. There are military plans developed by the Pentagon for what would take place if it came to a military engagement with Iran. Those are, again, incredibly sensitive documents that would be of immeasurable value to enemies of the United States.
And of course, any one of these classified documents might gain the attention of federal prosecutors. And we have, in witnessing the release of this indictment today, seen that there is a list of documents laid out in this speaking indictment, is what they call it in the legal world, in great detail. I just want to read to the audience watching right now. This is a statement from the special counsel's office, Jack Smith's office, just moments ago. An indictment returned on Thursday, June 8th, obviously yesterday, in the Southern District of Florida, charging Donald Trump and Walt Nauta, that John Carl just mentioned, was unsealed today. The defendants have been summoned to appear on Tuesday, June 13th, 3 p.m. That's what we reported last night here, 3 p.m. in courtroom 13-3 at the Wilkie Ferguson Federal Courthouse in Miami. The statement goes on to say Trump has been charged with willful retention of national defense information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corruptly concealing a document in a federal investigation, scheme to conceal, and false statements and representations. They go on to talk about that aide that John Carl just mentioned moments ago, saying that Walt Nauta has been charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corruptly concealing a document in a federal investigation, scheme to conceal, and false statements and representations. And here's where the math adds up at this hour. We mentioned 38 counts. 37 of those counts directly involve the former president, Donald Trump. One of those 38 counts involves Walt Nauta. I want to bring in Catherine Falders from our investigative team. Catherine was among the first to report out the range of these charges just after we came on the air last night. And Catherine, I remember when you told me on the air at least 7 counts, and to see 38 in total, 37 now, directly targeting the former president.
It's really incredible. And that statement that you just read from Jack Smith laid out those 7 categories of charges that we reported. There's at least 7 categories of charges that we reported last night. But what's remarkable about this is seeing this number, 38 counts in total here, 31 of those under this willful retention of national defense information. Those 31 documents under just that one charge are laid out in specific detail in this indictment. And of course, as you heard John Carl and Pierre Thomas talking about, this is an indictment that includes Donald Trump and Walt Nauta. Trump is charged with 37 of these counts. I think that's important. And then when you look at what Nauta is charged with, 6 counts in total. So that's the breakdown of the math here and where we're getting this. But exactly what we reported last night, we know the categories. We knew it was at least 7 counts. We knew at least 7 charges. But remarkable to see, especially that 31 number under that willful retention of national defense information. And when you read through this indictment, David, what was striking to me especially is when you see how Trump was talking to his attorneys. On one of the pages here in his response, he is saying, well, what happens if we just don't respond at all, or we don't play ball with them? These are questions the former president is asking his lawyers. This is what Jack Smith is alleging Trump's obstruction of justice, his obstruction of their probe, and essentially not wanting to respond to the subpoena, despite Trump saying that he had been forthcoming and honest. David?
To that point, Catherine, let me follow up with you, because we have a lot of viewers who will say, well, wait a minute, we heard classified documents were discovered at the home of Mike Pence. He's now been cleared. We reported that out in recent days. We know that classified documents have been found at a former office of President Biden and at his one of his homes, that there are these multiple investigations now involving classified documents. Again, and we certainly don't know inside what they have found when it comes to the president. We know that Mike Pence in recent days was cleared. He had said it was a mistake, that it was an accident, turned the documents over as soon as they were requested. That's what the president contends. President Biden and the White House have said that they have also completely cooperated. Again, that is an investigation still underway. But what you just described right there, Catherine, would seem to be sort of the dividing line, the line in the sand here that differentiates the cases, what we know about them at this point, which is Jack Smith alleging in this indictment that this was not just classified documents by accident in the possession of a former president, but that when they were requested, that the former president then turned to his lawyers, to members of his team, and went over some of the options: hide, destroy documents. And as you just read, Catherine, can we just ignore the request to turn over these documents? Can we just simply not play ball? And that would seem to be obviously a key differentiation with what we know so far.
And it's precisely that dividing line that you describe here. I think the easiest way to break it down is how did Trump, how did Pence, how did Biden respond when they found these classified documents, when they knew these documents were in their possession? Obviously, the Biden matter is still under investigation by a special counsel. When Pence directed his attorneys to look for these documents, Pence immediately notified the Department of Justice and turned them over. Pence knew that he shouldn't have these in his possession. The difference here, and I think this will be emphasized in court by prosecutors, is that once investigators knew that they were in Trump's possession, Trump did not give them back. In fact, he went to court to fight it for months to claim that these documents were actually his and that they belonged to him, despite the government's multiple attempts to get them back, despite Trump having his lawyers certify in a written statement that they had all been returned. The reality was, and frankly, David, still is, that prosecutors do not know whether or not Trump still has any classified documents in his possession.
Catherine Falder's reporting in. Catherine helping us to break the news last night here on ABC and now going through the indictment with the rest of our team. Our thanks to you, Catherine. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas because, Pierre, we can now report that the American people not only have been given this indictment now to understand more fully what Jack Smith and his team believe they have discovered and have presented to a grand jury, the grand jury allowing for this indictment, of course. And now we will hear from Jack Smith himself.
David, the man who's not uttered a word in these many 6 months since he's been in investigation, will walk to cameras today. He will make a statement. He will not take questions, but he will try to put into context why this had to be done, the nature of the kinds of documents that President Trump allegedly took with him. And David, we have some new information that we're pulling from the indictment that is striking as well. The indictment is stating categorically that not only did Trump know that he had these classified documents, but that he was personally involved. That's the word they use, personally involved with taking them from the White House. Yeah. Another headline from the indictment is that They've listed the national security implications in terms of military programs, nuclear weapons. They're also stating categorically that there was information about sources and potential informants and the methods in which we're gathering information. And there's a list of the different kinds of agencies impacted by the kind of documents that President Trump allegedly took. The Central Intelligence Agency, he took documents relating to their work. He took documents related to the Department of Defense. He took documents related to the NSA, also the Department of Energy, and also the State Department. So they're listing that he took, had a personal file, if you will, of some of the most classified documents from some of the most sensitive agencies in the federal government. And as Catherine was just pointing out, this exchange with his attorneys, in which the attorneys apparently took personal notes. And again, you can see the level of investigation that the special counsel went to in terms of getting this information. This exchange where they have the notes of the attorney, and the president allegedly says, quote, "I don't want anybody looking. I don't want anybody looking through my boxes. I really don't. I don't want you looking through my boxes." Well, what if we just don't respond at all? Wouldn't it be better if we told them we don't have anything here? Well, it'll look better if there are no documents. It's just stunning, David.
Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent. Pierre, thank you. And to Pierre's point here, in reading through the indictment, one of the things that Jack Smith lays out, he says, during his presidency, Trump gathered classified documents and other materials in boxes, including information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities of the United States and its allies to military attack from another foreign country, and plans for possible retaliation in response to a foreign attack. The unauthorized disclosure of these classified documents, Jack Smith says in this indictment, could put at risk the national security of the United States, foreign relations, and the safety of the United States military. Martha Raddatz, our Chief Global Affairs anchor, what do you make of this?
David, this is so serious, and I am struck by this as well. It's certainly putting our national defense and our safety at risk, but also classified information related to intelligence sources, methods, and analytical processes. That, when he's talking about intelligence sources, those are people possibly who helped the United States, who helped keep us safe, and they too could be in danger if we are talking about human sources here. And as to those meetings that Donald Trump was having according to these indictments, and we do know at one point Donald Trump, according to a source I have, was interested in attacking Iran. In fact, he was told by General Milley that that would be a very bad idea, and General Milley outlined to him what that would entail, and that U.S. forces could be at risk and thousands of people could possibly die. So General Milley was trying to deter Donald Trump, who had been told by a staff member that it would only take 7 days and Iran would no longer be a problem. So this is incredibly classified information that's vital to the safety of the United States. David.
Martha, thank you. And of course, one of the first people to confirm that the indictment was taking place last night was Donald Trump himself on social media, saying, "I have been informed that I have been indicted," going on to say, "I am innocent." And again, innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, obviously, and this is very early on. Again, we're simply reporting on the vast scope of counts here. 38 counts, 37 of them directly targeting former President Trump himself. And Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, as you hear everyone begin to piece together the narrative of this indictment, it is striking the personal involvement that Jack Smith is alleging here, the personal involvement of the former president at every step of the way here.
And the fact that a lot of this information about how we know of his personal involvement is coming from his own lawyers. I mean, that's really unique. You don't very often have a case where lawyers are being forced to testify against a client. But here, as we now see in the indictment, what they're alleging is that Donald Trump was effectively trying to fool his own lawyers. And so he was trying to lie to them to get them to deceive the FBI and others. And that's why this became that very unique situation where someone's own lawyer can be forced to testify. One other interesting point, as we sort of take a breath here and look through the totality of this indictment, is they lay out in very specific detail the classifications of all of the documents. Because there are some who sort of are just throwing all classified documents into one category. Well, there were some classified documents, et cetera. This indictment is very specific. The boxes, the documents, et cetera, were found in two different locations primarily, and they list, for example, in his office, that 6 of them were top secret, 18 were secret, which is the level below that, 3 confidential, which is the lowest level. In another location, 11 that were top secret, 36 that were secret, and 28 that were confidential. And again, he lays out the definition for top secret in this indictment. Information was classified as top secret if the unauthorized disclosure of that information reasonably could be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage to the national security that the original classification authority was able to identify or describe. And so for those who are, asking the question, what exactly did he have? Yes, there are that list of the 31, which apparently were the most sensitive documents of all. But there were also these additional documents with the precise classification that is laid out in this indictment.
For people watching, Dan, does this play out? Does a criminal trial play out before the election, before the 2024 election? And what more can you began the conversation last night here with me, but what more can you tell us about the venue in Florida and now the judge who at least initially has been put in charge of the case here?
So this district in Florida is known for moving cases quickly, but I wouldn't read too much into that, right? When you talk about the fact that typically the 70-day period where someone has for a speedy trial is executed very often, that they like to move things quickly. That power to move things quickly or not really belongs largely to the defendant. And I don't think that Donald Trump is going to have any incentive to move this case forward quickly. Because remember, if Donald Trump wins for president in November of 2024, he could make this case go away. And so I think that he will make a bet that it is better to take a chance to delay it than to rush the case to trial, particularly when you look at the details here, particularly when you see how much testimony and evidence they would have from various people, putting aside guilt or innocence. It just will be very bad for Donald Trump politically as well as this testimony comes out. So I'd expect they're going to try to move it till after the election in 2024. The question will be, can they push it back that far?
Dan Abrams, my thanks to you as always. Our political director, Rick Klein, is pouring through this as well. And Rick, something that stands out really to all of us who have been reading this is how much of Donald Trump's own words and quotes have been included in this 49-page indictment. And you and I both know, in covering Donald Trump for years, he doesn't use email, he doesn't text people, and that has largely protected him at so many points along the way. But it is stunning, the number of examples of direct quotes from Donald Trump.
Truly, David. And of course, prosecutors were watching the campaign tapes back in 2016, what he said about classified documents, often in the context of his campaign against Hillary Clinton, where he said he would enforce those laws very strictly and without exception. And then fast forward to this documents case, it appears that even though he wasn't communicating in text or email, a lot of people around him were taking notes, including his own attorneys, including the recording of that conversation with the reporter where he says these documents, I could have classified them when I was president, but of course I can't now. And these conversations with attorneys where he appears to suggest that they all should go away. It is striking to me, David, because Donald Trump says so much in public as well as in private, and often the words don't seem to matter. In this case, they matter quite a bit, and they are key to the narrative that prosecutors have put together in these indictments.
And again, it's not hearsay, as Dan Abrams just pointed out, Rick. This comes from his own attorneys and aides who worked so closely with Donald Trump this entire time.
That's right. And the strategy of prosecutors of bringing all these different individuals in for disparate parts of the case, getting them under oath, getting them to recount and recall and provide their notes and recordings, all of that put a squeeze on Donald Trump that he appeared to be resisting right to the end. Now to have this indictment there in black and white, his own words out there as key to the case, is a really stunning piece of this case. As Dan said, very unusual to have lawyers' own testimony involved in this. These are aides around him that are direct witnesses to the activities that are alleged here.
Really appreciate it, Rick. Thank you. And of course, Donald Trump, immediately after learning he'd been indicted last night, saying, "I'm an innocent man," describing this investigation in terms that we have heard before and reported along the way. He has constantly said that he believes this is an ongoing witch hunt in so many words, and other descriptions that he's used in the past for investigations involving him, applying to this investigation as well. I do want to get to John Santucci. John, you and I were talking before we came on the air. The former president had not seen this indictment. He knew the range of charges, as did we, but they did not know the 38 counts and the 37 counts directly involving the former president until this was released in the last hour?
David, I have gotten one word continuously from my sources, and that is reading. They are reading through this document right now. They are huddled with him in Bedminster. We saw images of Donald Trump earlier today, out golfing, trying to pass the day. But this document now, David, this is the only thing they're focused on. And, you know, listen, I've covered Donald Trump for nearly a decade. I can tell you one of the things that reading through this document that I know Donald Trump is most definitely focused on is the images. He's flipping through this document. He's looking at the images. How did they get this? Where is that coming from? Just knowing the way that this former president thinks. And then he's going to see that a lot of these images, David, were provided by his most loyal aide. Now, Nauta obviously complied with the subpoena. He turned over that information as part of the special counsel's request. But knowing Donald Trump, that's still going to bother him. You know, we made a note earlier that he said to one of his lawyers, can we just not answer them, not respond? You've got to imagine that seeing those images from his most loyal aide in this document that are really a blow to Donald Trump, that is going to be stinging him right now, David.
We're seeing some of those images right here on the screen right now. John Santucci, thank you again. They are reading through this indictment, along with the rest of us, Donald Trump's legal team at Bedminster in New Jersey, where the president has been huddled, the former president, with his advisors, knowing this was coming. We had reported earlier in the week of that letter Donald Trump had received from the special counsel Jack Smith in recent days, saying officially, in so many words, that you are the target of a federal criminal investigation connected to your handling of classified documents. We reported that out, that in essence was a signal that this indictment could very well be coming, and now we are reading it. 49 pages, 38 counts, 37 of them directly targeting the former president. I want to bring in Terry Moran, if I could, because it's now coming up on 2:30 here in the East. 30 minutes from now, the country will hear from Jack Smith. We have not heard from him up until this point. We will hear from the special counsel. And one of the things, Terry, is, you know, he certainly could have waited until next Tuesday when the former president has to appear in federal court in Florida to unseal this indictment, to present it to the former president and to the country. But it would seem, and this is just speculation here, but it would seem that they're trying to preempt this sort of vacuum of several days where people can sort of fill the void by putting this indictment out. And Terry, as you know, it's a speaking indictment. It goes into granular detail about what they believe they've uncovered here.
It really does, a speaking indictment indeed. And Jack Smith is known as a by-the-book prosecutor. This is not a by-the-book move. This press conference, the release of the indictment before the defendant makes the first appearance, but he's indicting the former president of the United States in the court of public opinion as well. And I think one of the things the great public interest requires perhaps a departure from that by-the-book approach. And also, as you suggest, there is a strategic necessity here for the government's case to get out because Donald Trump is going to put his case out. And so I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing it. As far as the speaking indictment, there's one thing going through it that it doesn't speak to, and that's motive. Why? Why did he do it? Why did he not just take all these documents home? Why did he connive, according to the indictment, to keep them secret after the government asked, at first politely, and then more forcefully, and then with a subpoena? What is the motive here? There's a great deal of, as we've been reviewing, Donald Trump's own words that do tell you things about his state of mind, where he says to people, I don't want anybody looking. And there's another passage where one of his lawyers has found some classified documents, has them in a folder, asks what he should do with them. And according to that lawyer, Trump kind of makes a plucking motion and just suggests to the lawyer that perhaps you could just toss them out. This is conduct that is chaotic, which people are used to, and according to this indictment, obviously illegal. The question is why? At the end of the day, the jurors are going to be asked to convict the defendant, the man, Donald Trump, and they will want some insight as to why this all happened and how they should weigh the motive here. And I think one of the things that the prosecution has done in this indictment is put in Trump's own words what he was doing and his attitude that he knew it was wrong. That passage where he says, in my administration, included in this indictment are quotes from his campaign. In my administration, we're going to protect classified information and prosecute to the fullest extent of the law those who disclose it. I guarantee you that at the closing argument, the prosecutor will stand up and say, I know it's hard to convict the former president of the United States, but listen to his own words about these laws he was sworn to uphold. We don't get to the why, but we do get to the conduct of the president in his own words in this indictment.
Terry Moran on the indictment here this afternoon, and on Jack Smith, the special counsel, who we will hear from less than a half an hour from now. Terry, our thanks to you. I know you'll be back with us in about a half an hour when we do hear from the special counsel, when the American people hear from him. They have already, in one form, heard from him in this 49-page indictment. Again, 37 counts directed at the former president. Those counts involve willful retention of classified documents, obstruction when it was requested that he turn those documents back over to authorities. And again, as we pour through the indictment, and we will continue to report this out throughout the day, but these documents and the range of documents involving military capabilities of foreign countries, of the U.S. as well, of the U.S. nuclear program and weapons, the capabilities, the risk for the U.S. and our allies to come under attack from foreign countries, and what that potential response would be. That's just some of the range of the documents that Jack Smith alleges that Donald Trump willfully retained. That wasn't a surprise that he willfully retained those documents. That's the allegation. Donald Trump says he's innocent. He is in Bedminster, New Jersey at this hour, surrounded by lawyers and advisors who are reading through this 49-page indictment with the former president. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. As I mentioned, about 27 minutes from now, we'll be back on the air with Jack Smith, the special counsel, who certainly knows the weight of history in this moment. I'm David Muir. I'll see you then. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.